Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the international affairs, foreign policy, and global development community, and world news aficionados of all stripes. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. The American foreign policy tradition, at least in my lifetime, has been dominated by just a few ideologies, isms, if you will. This includes the neoconservatism of the Regan and George W. Bush eras and the liberal internationalism of the Clinton and Obama administrations. Of course, not every foreign policy decision neatly fits into these categories, but it is fair to say that by and large, these have been the two overriding foreign policy outlooks of the last 30 or 40 years of American history. My guest today, Robert Wright, has helped to introduce a new kind of intellectual tradition to the public square. He calls it progressive realism. And we kick off this conversation going through some of the key principles of a progressive realist U.S. foreign policy. We then discuss how this ideology might be applied to some key foreign policy challenges, including competition with China and conflict in the Middle East. Robert Wright is the author of several books, including a book we reference in this conversation called NonZero. He runs a fantastic newsletter of the same name, and it was an edition of that newsletter that inspired me to reach out to him for this conversation. I'll post a link to his NonZero newsletter in the description field of this podcast episode. I will also post a link to a December Washington Post op-ed that we reference throughout this conversation, in which Robert Wright sketches out key concepts of a progressive realist foreign policy. So I'd be curious to learn what you think of this episode and if this is an ideology, a foreign policy outlook that resonates with you. Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. You can hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg or send me an email using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. For now, here is my conversation with Robert Wright.
You know, in the Washington Post piece, I did list four kind of hallmarks, I guess, of a progressive realist. I have added to that list in other places, but in the Post piece, I mentioned, first of all, strategic humility, meaning an awareness that things can go badly awry when you intervene militarily, whether directly or by proxy. And we have examples of both in fairly recent history. You know, the Iraq invasion didn't go swimmingly. The Syria proxy intervention seems to have, failed to remove Assad from power, and if anything, increased the number of deaths and refugees. Libya didn't work out well, and so on. So that's one thing that a progressive realist would emphasize. Another one that I mentioned is cognitive empathy, by which I mean not the feel your pain kind of empathy, but just perspective taking, just understanding how all the actors that are relevant to a given situation are viewing things. So, for example, when we, kind of got involved in Ukrainian politics during the Obama administration, and, certainly from Putin's point of view, played a role in deposing a democratically elected president who was pro-Russian, we might have stopped to ask ourselves how that would, how seriously would Putin take that? Turns out he took it very seriously. And the result was a lot of trouble, including Russia taking Crimea and supporting rebels in eastern Ukraine. I would say much the same about NATO expansion earlier.
Like another good example is the question of why, if Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction, did he not just open up his country to weapons inspectors and avoid being invaded and occupied by the United States? And there's a famous academic article that explains that. I'm blanking on its name, but basically the idea is that, he was bound by certain, concepts of rationality that the White House couldn't foresee, couldn't understand, didn't have the empathy to understand.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, first of all, memory being the selective and even constructive thing that it is, there's a tendency these days to underestimate the extent to which he did open up to inspectors. He let them in the country, and he actually, I think, let them in every facility they asked to inspect. In the beginning, he kind of had them cool their heels for a while. Yeah. He also resisted around the margins. He didn't let scientists be taken out of Iraq for interrogation. But, you can imagine lots of reasons for that, including just humiliation and so on. But I think that is a good example where we were eager to take every sign of resistance from him as evidence that he had something to hide. And that's a very good example.
And another principle you articulate is anti-Manichaeism. What do you mean by that?
Manichaeism is the tendency to divide the world into good and evil. It's, maybe in some ways a natural human tendency, but it certainly, I think, has been more characteristic of American foreign policy than I'd like to see. And I think you're starting to see a kind of a new version of it. The people in the Biden administration foreign policy team came out of the box very eager to kind of declare a global war on authoritarianism. So I think they're tending to divide the world between democracies and authoritarian countries, which would actually be more defensible if they did a better job of it. For example, didn't overlook authoritarian countries who, because they're our allies, we don't complain about, like Saudi Arabia and so on. But in general, to see yourself as in a war, a kind of a global war against evil, is I think has gotten us into a lot of trouble. It's a little tied in with American exceptionalism, the idea of that America is kind of uniquely good, and it's our mission to make the rest of the world as good as we are. But yeah, that is one of the things I associated with progressive realism. A resistance to that kind of dualistic and somewhat melodramatic view of the world.
I think Obama was pretty good on that score, at least obviously compared to his predecessor, who was, very firmly divided the world into good and evil, declared a war on evil.
Yeah, Bush actually, talked about an axis of evil and really thought about the world in those terms. And you see some of the damage that can do. I agree that Obama was better. I in the end, I don't think he had a really well-formed foreign policy philosophy. He had some realist tendencies, but yeah, certainly compared to Bush, that's not even a close call. The final kind of dimension of progressive realism I mentioned in the Post piece was respect for international law. Lots of people say they're for international law, but in the foreign policy establishment, there are very few people who actually take it seriously as a guiding light. I mean, we've already mentioned a couple of things the U.S. did that pretty clearly violated international law. The Iraq invasion, clearly. The proxy intervention in Syria, pretty clearly. There's some argument. A lot of people would say that in Libya, when we did have the Security Council mandate going in for the humanitarian part of the mission, but then when that morphed into a regime change operation, some people would say at that point you were violating international law. In any event, it is something that I take very seriously, and it's related to something that wasn't one of the four dimensions in the Post piece, but I have mentioned it elsewhere, and it was mentioned in the Post piece, which is international governance. And in a way, this is a big, kind of motivating thing for progressive realism, is the idea that if we don't get serious about international governance, what's sometimes called global governance, I use the term international governance partly because sometimes there's regional governance. It's not
like multilateral cooperation.
Yeah. I mean, It's funny. I started using global governance years ago because, in part, because some people on the right were so freaked out by world government, and world government, I think, is truly misleading. I don't think anybody's thinking about a kind of a centralized.
Well, you haven't talked to people in the World Federalist Movement in a long time.
Well, actually, didn't they? I mean, the one of the main organizations there, I thought moved a little away from.
They in general have. You're
Yeah,
right. You're right.
I gave a talk there when John Anderson, the late John Anderson, was president, and there was then a big in-house debate about whether, they were incrementalists or what. But anyway, global world government, of course, spooks the far right, but so does global governance. And in any event, I think it's kind of misleading because there are important regional forms of governance, but certainly it's a conviction of mine that if the world doesn't get a lot more serious about institutionalized international cooperation, we're going to be in trouble. I mean, the most famous example is climate change, but I think that's kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think when you think seriously about bioweapons control, obviously pandemics too, but weapons in space, controlling those, even things like artificial intelligence. If you imagine nations developing AI in a context of just fierce international competition with no rules of the road, that could get out of hand. Human genetic engineering.
The UN is working on a killer robots protocols and conventions for automated intelligence military purposes. But no, I totally see what you're saying. If I don't think of myself as a particularly ideological person, but if I do have a guiding ideology, it is that the world has a suite of problems that require global cooperation to solve, and that multilateral cooperation, global governance, institutions like the United Nations can be useful to that end. So you have me there. I did want to ask you about what some real world applications of a progressive realist outlook might entail. There is probably no greater foreign policy challenge than competition between the United States and China. And maybe just to drill down a little bit, we have a situation in Hong Kong right now where a city, a society that, just a couple of years ago was a bastion of liberty and free speech is now increasingly under, the repressive control of Chinese authorities. What would a progressive realist do about that situation or propose be American foreign policy regarding Hong Kong?
Well, as the term progressive realism suggests, first of all, we would try to be realistic. We don't have the power to transform China's approach to Hong Kong. In general, the emphasis on international cooperation and the belief that it really is kind of an existential issue, possibly at a planetary level in the long run, leads you to be careful about what you ask of other nations and demand of other nations and so on. I mean, I think, with China, let's face it, there are several areas where we would all, if we could, change things. There's Xinjiang, the situation with the Uyghurs. There's the possibility of war with Taiwan. There's Hong Kong. But I don't, I think we have to be honest about the limitations of what we can do there. And, you try to make your values clear, but this is, and this has been a source of real tension within the foreign policy community to some extent, within the progressive part of the foreign policy community. To what extent do you emphasize humanitarian issues in other countries? And I think, one thing that's happened over the past 20 years is we've seen that, and this is, I would say, a belief of progressive realism, is that you have to be wary of the tendency of good intentions here to go awry. The Syrian proxy intervention was justified largely on humanitarian grounds. I would say that had we and our allies not fueled the civil war via proxy intervention, maybe hundreds of thousands, fewer people would be dead. I don't know, but I think something along those lines. I'd say something like that in Libya. So, I think those kinds of solutions in China, you have to realistically rule out, right? Solutions that forceful. And I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of sanctions. I mean, sanctions almost never work. Right now, they are making people in the following countries suffer: Venezuela, Syria, Iran. There are others. And so far as I can tell, they're not doing any good in any of those situations. So I just, I
would, I mean, just to maybe like push you on this question of Hong Kong in particular. I mean, I do fear that people discount the potential harm to Americans should our stance towards that question of liberty, democracy, free speech in Hong Kong be too overly accommodationist. I mean, you saw this incident, was it like in fall of 2019, in which that NBA coach from the Houston Rockets tweeted something about, democracy in Hong Kong. And then, the NBA was shut out of China briefly. There was like a mass protest in China against the Houston Rockets, against the NBA. And, he had to censor himself. And you saw that as just like the most high profile example of an American institution with huge cultural clout self-censoring itself in the face of what the Chinese thought to be appropriate speech. So in a way, you have China's approach to Hong Kong affecting freedom of speech here in the United States. And that's something that deeply concerns me. And there are other examples of that, in which, institutions and countries with commercial ties to China, censor what they say.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, I wouldn't say that's about Hong Kong per se. I mean, he could have said something about the Uyghurs and just as easily gotten the same blowback, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that's exactly a generic problem about a country with the clout, the commercial clout that China has, and wants to use it the way they want to use it. Now, I think, so far, it doesn't look like a grave threat to free speech in America for a couple of reasons. One is, by and large, people in his position, that is, kind of corporate types, haven't been, opined about politics as a rule anyway. They generally just kind of lay low. So it's not like that was a major forum for American, debate over issues. Now I'm
it
against
is now
it.
Though the NBA at least is now, they're like they're leading edge of the Black Lives Matter movement.
That's true. That's a new thing that they're doing. I think. I mean, this is an issue of generic concern. It's not. It's not about Hong Kong per se. Is what I mean. Yeah. It is about China because they're doing it more than others. And it's I don't. It's not that easy for me to imagine American government policy solution to that. And, Hollywood's another place where it shows up.
Yeah.
I think Hollywood is in a way the most concerning arena for this in a way. And even there, I don't exactly consider it existential. I don't have a solution to that problem. And I don't know what the American government would do about that. As for Hong Kong itself, it's kind of in a twilight area. That is to say, it was in British hands, but with a kind of contractual understanding that it would revert to Chinese hands. And then the terms of the agreement for that conversion have seemed to have been violated by China. But realistically, I mean, do you have a plan? I mean, nobody who has a plan. I guess the thing I'd say is, if you believe, as I do, that international cooperation is critical, then then you prioritize that. You don't quit criticizing people for things you disagree with. On the other hand, at the same time, I do think, I've always thought American leaders should limit their sermonizing tendencies. This goes back decades. It's just, because I'll give you an example. At the Anchorage summit, Tony Blinken and Jake
This
Sullivan.
was the summit, just to remind people, this was the summit between top U.S. foreign policy officials and top Chinese officials that took place in Alaska.
And Blinken and Sullivan said something about, did a little lecturing about respecting the rule of law, internationally. And Chinese officials rightly said, "Are you kidding? Mm-hmm. You invaded Iraq. You did this, you did that." I mean, the American government has paid no consistent attention to the rules, and this gets back to cognitive empathy. It would help America to understand the way we are perceived abroad. Mm-hmm. Like many nations, we have a very high opinion of ourselves, but when we lecture people, it behooves us to understand how we are being perceived. And understanding that their view of us may not be the same as our view of us. And in some cases, their view of us may be more accurate. And look, on human rights, when we lecture other countries on human rights, some of them say, we have capital punishment. We think that's like primitive. We don't do that. We don't have the same percentage of our population in prison that you do. And they can go on and on and on. And or we consider healthcare a right. You don't provide healthcare. I'm not saying that any of these would be satisfactory answers when you have a case as extreme as, say, the Uyghurs, but I am saying that whenever we lecture other countries about abiding by the rule of law or their human rights policies, we should be mindful of the way we look to others. And I think our failure to do that costs us dearly.
So I wanted to drill down on this concept of realism. Conventional international relations theory, realism is sort of a way of seeing the world in which power is relative, that one country's gain is automatically another country's loss. It's a very sort of a zero-sum outlook on the world. But, I, having read your wonderful book, NonZero, which was profoundly influential to me early in my foreign policy career, I know that's not how you see the world. So can you just kind of explain what you mean by realism?
Yeah, so realism, it has both a descriptive side and a prescriptive side. And it's unusual. Not all ideologies have official descriptions of the world, and not all descriptive international relations schools of thought are associated with prescriptive views. But in the case of realism, there is both. And first of all, I'd say that the part of realism that I most identify with, I certainly don't identify wholly with conservative realism, but the part of it I identify with is more on the prescriptive side. I mean, not so much on the descriptive side. And on the prescriptive side, there are very big differences. I mean, conservative realists don't emphasize developing international governance to the extent that I do, or respect for international law, maybe. And actually, that speaks to your question. The reason I think international governance is critical is that relations are getting more non-zero sum among nations. Climate change is a non-zero sum game. It can get worse for all of us or better, depending on how we play the game. Same with nuclear arms control. Same with all kinds of things. Same with health problems like pandemics, biological weapons control, and so on. And my belief is that for that reason, even if you focus on national interest, as realists on the right tend to do, you will still believe that we need to do more in the way of international governance, because the whole definition of a non-zero sum situation is that your fate is more and more intertwined with the fates of other players. And that's why it's in your interest to cooperate towards solutions that benefit you all. Now, I think you're right that conservative realists have had a tendency to view things as zero sum. However, if you look at the book Politics Among Nations, I think it is, by Hans Morgenthau, who is considered by some the founder of realism, certainly
Mr. Realism himself.
Yeah. If you look in that book, he says, as technology changes, it could well be that a realist could embrace world government. He says that. Okay. And that's what I would say, is that technological change has made relations, more non-zero sum relations among nations, and for that reason, not world government per se, but more and more in the way of international governance is in order.
So, lastly, the reason that I wanted to have you on to discuss this is not just because the ideas, contained in your op-ed and in your other writing are interesting, which they are, but it's also because at least I've seen a greater acceptance and almost institutional support for some of the ideas of progressive realism coming to the fore. Now, it still stands outside the mainstream of U.S. foreign policy circles, but you have an institution like the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is kind of this new think tank that articulates a lot of the principles that you just described. That is a collaboration between, George Soros of the left and Charles Koch of the right. What do you sort of make of the kind of ecosystem of the U.S. foreign policy that's being built around these concepts, and sort of what are you seeing happening on that front?
Yeah, I'd say Quincy is kind of broadly realist. There are conservative realists there, and there are progressive people I would call progressive realists there. And that in a way reflects, I guess, the two sources of funding that you referred to. But I think, one reason realism is having a kind of resurgence is because we have seen that, idealism of a certain kind, of a kind of naive kind, can have devastating consequences. I've mentioned several of the well-intentioned interventions that have gone awry. And I think there's something that has revived that was originally, I think, a big part of the idea behind the United Nations. Originally, the United Nations attached a lot of significance to the sovereignty of nations, because at that point, the big problem was the recurrence of war. And so basically they said, look, you can do pretty much what you want to do in your borders. However, if you commit transborder aggression, we're going to have a whole mechanism set up to punish you. Now, as time wore on, and maybe because we started to take for granted the success in that, relatively speaking, the success of the discouraging of transborder aggression, although that was probably largely a function of the Cold War as well. Anyway, there was more and more interest in the possibility of intervention sanctioned under international law for humanitarian reasons, and that kind of culminated in the R2P, the responsibility to protect doctrine, which I think was invoked in, for example, the Libya intervention, which did not go well.
It was the only time it had been invoked to justify the military intervention under Chapter 7 of the UN Security Council. It was the 2011 resolution calling for intervention in Libya, which, you mentioned earlier was initially intended to prevent a mass atrocity event in Benghazi at the time. Gaddafi's forces were threatening mass slaughter of a large city. And this was like how R2P was supposed to work.
Right. And so I think you now have both on the left and on the right some people saying, well, obviously, first of all, there are internal situations so grave that they warrant intervention, ideally with the sanction of international law, as in the Bosnian intervention in the 90s. But there are things so great, for example, Rwanda, where you if the Security Council wouldn't do it, you probably wouldn't wait. If you thought there was something you could do to stop atrocities on that scale, at the same time, I think there is more respect for the way well-intentioned interventions in the internal affairs of countries can go awry, and so in that sense, there's a little bit of a return among some people to what maybe the spirit of the original founding of the United Nations. I'm still, I supported the Bosnian intervention. It was sanctioned by the Security Council, and so but I still think that that's one of the things that accounts for what you're talking about. And I guess I think also, and I think you've seen more of this at Quincy, even than you did at the founding of Quincy not long ago, is attention to the need to get nations to cooperate to solve the various problems that I talked about, and a recognition, that there's only so much political capital you can burn up, lecturing countries about internal policies or sanctioning them or whatever, and still get as much cooperation as the planet needs. And this is, you mentioned my book, NonZero. Thank you. This is something I'm focusing on a lot in the newsletter by the same name, NonZero, which is the center of what I'm calling, only half jokingly, the Apocalypse Aversion Project, where we look at various kinds of long-term, very serious threats to the planet, not just some of the specific issue areas I've mentioned, bioweapons and climate change, but also the problem of human psychology and the way, cognitive biases feed into conflict that winds up being catastrophic and things like that.
Well, everyone should sign up for your newsletter. It's fantastic. It's what inspired me to reach out to you for this episode.
Well, I really appreciate it, Mark, and I've become a fan of the podcast, and I'm glad to see you flourishing.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Bob. And in addition to all of the books Bob writes and all of the newspaper opining he does, he is also the founder of a platform called Blogging Heads. And this is a long-running public affairs show and now podcast. And before I started this podcast, I had a regular show on his platform in which we talked about the UN. So I did that for many years in like the mid-2000s, late 2000s. It was interesting stuff, and I've been a great fan of all of Bob's work since then. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.